Okay, now after the serious talk, this here is the not so, no, this is also a serious talk, but it's not a serious scholarship what I'm going to do, I'm afraid. As Amnon Reichmann said in his introduction, now we're faced here with, the problem of sanctions that involve corporations in very different ways. So financial sanctions, as you can see, of course, have a huge impact on the financial sector, but also on corporations down the road, which then are prevented by their payments and need to make, if they still want to engage in trade, lots of secondary transactions that ultimately all allow to evade financial sanctions. Financial sanctions are kind of a nuisance, but not really an absolute inhibition. But then we have got other phenomena. I'm just putting some pictures here. So you see Elon Musk, his SpaceX is providing internet services and a satellite-based communication to Ukraine. Gazprom, on the other hand, has played a crucial role in German debates recently because they're always using that, they're pretending to have technical problems, which are sometimes quite an immediate reaction to political behavior. And I'm not sure if you know the third company that I'm referring to here in the picture on the bottom right. This is chocolate. Chocolate also has become political because Rittersport decided, a German chocolate producer, decided not to pull out of Russia. And this has caused quite some controversy. And they explained that they're a small company. They're also dealing with other small companies, etc., but it didn't really help. So companies are really in the midst of that debate and are politically compromised to some extent. And I thought the relationship between the state and the corporation is really what we normally refer to as the economic constitution. So the economic constitution is a concept that arose in the early 20th century as, I would say, like a liberal democratic way of organizing economic relationships or organizing and containing capitalist modes of production. And it's important to stress that it's not only a matter for the domestic constitution, but that the economic constitution as such is the result also always of and reflective of the international legal order and framing that legal order. And that international legal order also determines the position of corporations in a given moment in the economy. Now, that's my definition on the economic constitution. And now the question that is in the focus of my talk is how the recent sanctions impact the economic constitution, meaning the position of corporations, the state-market divide, so to say, in the international order. Sanctions I use here in a very wide sense as measures of economic isolation. This is a definition from Woodrow Wilson of 1919, when in the interwar period, sanctions became a means of, basically a replacement of war for the first time. There is a recent book by Nicholas Mulder that recounts the prehistory of sanctions, so to say, from with a focus on the period from 1919 to 1945. And I follow that. So sanctions don't necessarily react to a behavior marked as illegal, but I apply that notion quite untechnically as a measure that is meant to somehow isolate another country. My method in this talk is interpretative. I'm trying to look at the facts, at the empirical developments, and make sense of that. I'm trying to read law in context and understand the shape of the international economic order. So I'm not so much looking for the legality or illegality of certain sanctions, but my question is, what does the development, the field of sanctions, tell us about the development of the international legal order in general? Which means I have to cover here a lot of material and I have to be a bit short. And my thesis is that we are here entering slowly, or we're seeing much clearer, a new stage that has been entered already a while ago. And what stage is that? Well, here are my three stages, which are at the same time the three parts of my presentation. After this introduction, I'll first talk about what I consider as hegemonic liberalism, lasting from about 1985 to 2000. Then I'm talking about struggling liberalism, which followed in the 14, 15 years between 2000 and 2014, 2016. And then what I think what we are entering now is an economic constitution, an international economic constitution that one could describe as contained liberalism. Let me walk you through this step by step. What's hegemonic liberalism? Well, it's the unipolar attitude, or the unipolar world order in an economic sense that has persisted from about 1985 to 2000s. There are some developments that already take place before 1990. That's why I make the cut there. And the context is that international economic law in many respects has provided for an economic liberalization, an unprecedented liberalization that begins actually already in the 1970s with capital controls that fall, but then the Volcker shock in some ways also a means of economic liberalization in the hegemonic way, because it established the primacy of the dollar, a dollar-dominated economy, or it entrenched that freshly after the end of the Bretton Woods system. And then, of course, in the 1990s, we have got the rise of investment law and the rise of the WTO. Other fields of international law don't have a big impact on that economic order in the 1990s. For example, human rights law, the discussion is there. What's the relationship between human rights and economic law? But it doesn't go anywhere. It's just some NGOs and a few weird scholars that come with that. In the case law, you see very little in terms of implementing human rights norms into economic practice. Maybe only the World Bank is the one single organization that 1995 made that step, but then they always said, we're only respecting human rights to the extent that it doesn't respect our mandate, our political mandate. So there's not, it's quite a, that's why I say it's quite a hegemonic order. Now, sanctions in that period mostly came in the form of unilateral sanctions, or then also UN sanctions, so multilateral sanctions. Irina has carved out the different categories. And now I don't go through all of these cases, but the interesting thing here is what were the countries that were subject of sanctions, and what was the purpose of these sanctions? Well, the sanctions were mostly about states that were considered not to play by the rule of hegemonic liberalism in a dangerous way. And the subject of, the content of the sanctions mostly related to weapons. That's basically the multilateral sanctions. It's all about weapons, more or less. Or mostly, the unilateral US sanctions, they also targeted things like, oil components, etc. So it was really like something that was meant to bring these countries in compliance with the dominating hegemonic liberal order. So sanctions had a character of, or had an aspect of othering to them. They were defining what is a rogue state and what is not a rogue state. And so they were, to come to the liberal order, or to the economic constitution, economic order that I think is characteristic of this period, it was a liberal order that was deeply entrenched. Democracy and peace were conditions for that order to function, because they allow foreign corporations, or corporations, Western corporations, basically to spread. And the idea was that if corporations spread, there will be trickle-down economics, and there will be development, progressive development. So that's the underpinning. So it wasn't just a vicious strategy, but it was a strategy that thought that the best development is really that we have got free corporations everywhere. Now, I think this order is pretty clear. It's pretty straightforward. It gets a lot more complicated after the year 2000. Why is that so? Because multiple crises afflict the Western idea of economic hegemonic liberal order. I think that starts already with the Asian economic crisis in 1989, which kind of provided a shock to the idea of the Washington Consensus, to this, to this trickle-down economics. Yeah, just if you liberalize, then you will be fine. No, the Asian countries, they did everything. The tiger states, they did everything according to the book, so to say, and yet they came into a severe crisis. And September 11, of course, is another factor that is shaking also the self-consciousness and leading to a much more defensive attitude, and then even more so the global financial crisis. And now there are two possible reactions to that, or two perceivable, two distinguishable reactions to that episode of crisis, that series of crises. One of them is paddle back. Try to be less hegemonic, try to make the hegemonic liberal order better, a more inclusive economic order. And that's when debates like business and human rights come up, when the WTO all of a sudden thinks about sustainability, when the Millennium Development Goals and then the Sustainable Development Goals become developed and become really a focus of a lot of interest. Yet there's another strategy, and that brings me slowly to sanctions, which consists more in doubling down. So crisis is taken as a sign of weakness, and to regain strength, in particular for Western states, it is thought that some measure of economic isolation, i.e. some sanctions in that wide sense that I was defining it, would be necessary. And we can see all sorts of such measures. For example, in tariffs, the United States already in 2001 imposed tariffs on European steel, which were clearly protectionist. We see a wave of litigation in sovereign debt. We see rising criticism of WTO case law. We see then ultimately in a decade later, and we see the rise of mega regionals, TTIP and TPP, but it's not only limited to the United States. We see at the same time in many jurisdictions the rise of state-owned enterprises and the use of investment law for purposes which were sometimes not conducive to the resolution of crisis. So what can you make of or what's the role of sanctions? I think this leads already a little bit to sanctions. I think sanctions reflect this dual strategy, this undecidedness in the economic order between 2000 and 2014, 16. Yeah. On the one hand, those who prefer to paddle back, they also advance notions and influential and real developments like the move towards smart sanctions. Yeah, don't be so much across the board, but try to be more specific, more targeted. Make that whole thing a bit nicer and be not so hegemonic, but rather target only the individuals, not the population as such. That also concerns financial sanctions, which are targeted at individuals, at terrorists, against organizations, but not so much against states as such. And then we have got the whole debate arising that Irina referred to about standards that might be applicable to sanctions. And what comes up there is a new series of standards. We're not just talking about the prohibition of intervention here, but about proportionality, R2P, the responsibility to protect, or comity, a notion that you can find in section 403 of the Restatement of Foreign Relations Law of the United States. Yeah, and so there's the idea to discipline the sanctions regime. Yeah. The other strategy is to double down, and this basically comprises the economic measures that I just mentioned, which are sanctions in a wider sense, and in particular strategic litigation with a purpose of with a purpose of protectionism. Yeah. So the thing is not to make individual states. The purpose of sanctions is not so much to make individual states comply with an overall order, but rather to try to save a system that seems to be working against hegemonic powers. And Germany is just as much guilty of that as the United States. You see also a lot of problematic moves on that side. I don't want to put the whole blame on the United States, but you see Western countries that effectively take a lot of very cautious steps to save their position. And I think in a wider sense, we can also say that those are sanctions. Yeah. So what can we make of that struggling liberalism? Yeah, as I said, it's a little bit undecided. What's the nexus? Oh, sorry, I think there's a slide missing. But anyway, just to wrap up on struggling liberalism, I think the state-corporate nexus changes a little bit. There are two different developments that we can see. On the one hand, you see progressive internationalists that want to discipline corporations, business and human rights. On the other hand, and this doubling down on hegemonic tendencies, I think, is a clear sign of changing weights within Western industrialized states, where economic actors get more power to lobby for certain developments. For example, to lobby for the states to take up cases and bring them to the WTO, to lobby for a certain regime in relation to sovereign debt, to lobby for tariffs, etc. So this is a clear sign of a shifting relationship between the corporation and the state. So the corporation gets ahead, so to say. And the question is whether this is now still really the case, or whether we are facing a different phase. And I think that is actually the case. What I think is the phase we've entered now is what I call contained liberalism. Well, what's the context? Well, the context is clearly the crisis of liberal democracy everywhere, in many jurisdictions, in many different forms, from Trump to Orban, from Bolsonaro to the EU attempt to save the rule of law. There's a lot that can be said on that, and of course that is not something that remains without an impact on the economic order. At the same time, global problems like climate, demographics, and health make it somehow impossible to fall back to a Cold War situation. Yeah, so we're not really getting to a divide as we had it during the Cold War. I think there's too much. There are too many stakes, and there's too much interrelation and too many global problems that can't be solved by country alone. Now, in that context, what's the evolution of sanctions that we can observe? I think this context somehow inspires and maybe is inspired by innovations in the field of sanctions. First of all, we've got new instruments. The sanctions I'm talking here about are, all the measures adopted by Trump, but also many of the measures adopted by China, which very often, for example, tries to carve out, to crush out competitors. And then we have got the multilateral sanctions against Russia, and measures against Venezuela and Iran of certain groups of states. And what's characteristic about them? Well, the first of all is the invocation of national security. No? Whether that is really protectionist or not is probably a subject to debate, but I'm increasingly unsure if protectionism is really the right solution. Protectionism was rather the logic that one followed in the prior period under struggling liberalism, or some of the developments that we see under struggling liberalism. I'm not so sure whether national security is really protectionist or whether it doesn't amount to something else. I'll keep you in suspense for a moment. We see financial sanctions, which are interesting because their impact is so heavy. Yeah. So, and financial sanctions not just against individuals like suspected terrorists, but against states. And that is really an impact that applies across the board. Nevertheless, it's very easy to undermine financial sanctions. So especially if they're adopted unilaterally. So you can either change your trade relations and do trade with someone else who still accepts your currency, or you can, make business with third parties, so to say. So what is severed is the direct relationship, and therefore maybe the vulnerability, between the countries. And we also see that immunities don't seem to be an obstacle to some of these measures. Now, whether central bank assets are immune or not, we can debate that back and forth, but we see that these immunities aren't as sacrosanct anymore as one may have believed they would have been earlier on, when the idea was still to build one really fully liberalized international economic order. So the impact of these sanctions is also very different. We're talking here not only about sanctions that are meant to isolate one state and induce that state to compliance. That might still be the case with Iran, probably. I think Iran is the best example. But in many cases here, we've got sanctions, in particular in Russia, but also to some extent Venezuela, where the point is really to divide and to sever economic ties. So you see a substitution of imported products by other products. You see a fragmentation of markets, and you see a dissolution of once global value chains, which are not so global anymore. A development that already COVID has anticipated, where I think we also had a lot of national security measures that one could group under sanctions here. Yeah, so I think it's quite clear that looking at that, we're not in Kansas anymore, but the question is, where are we, in which state? And what international economic order is it? I'm naming it contained liberalism, and I'm trying to put some flesh on the bare bones of that concept by offering you 3 guiding principles, which I believe are characteristic for the current international economic order, and which we also can observe in all these economic sanctions. Now, one would be the principle of sustainability. There's a lot of risk containment on the part of states and companies. So sanctions and divisive measures, trade measures are not taken only for protectionist reasons, but also to protect, not to gain an economic advantage, but also to protect your vital interests. And I think the COVID crisis has already shown that very clearly, that we have to think beyond protectionism here alone. Another aspect, what I see here, or another principle which I see emerging here, is what I want to call resilience. I think that resilience is a term that might describe some of the exceptions that are being made from sanctions, like for the promotion of fundamental human rights, like for food deliveries. We just had this wonderful talk by Diane, and you see that there's ultimately some exception that is being made. Also, medical issues in COVID, we saw a lot of evolution here that these extreme things that are of a vital global interest, that if you don't respect them, might have massive global repercussions, like a famine or like a never-ending pandemic, that they are being taken into account. And I think we can say that there is a tendency to make both states and corporations responsible for that. Yeah, if you look at pharmaceuticals, you clearly see that there is in the public debate, so to say, and also in the legal arrangements that then are being taken, that there is something like a responsibility for corporations. And the third notion that I want to propose here is that of neutrality. I think the current contained liberalism leads to a revival of that idea, even though the United States famously tries to attack everyone who's not following their sanctions. I think it's pretty clear that they're at a that this position is not leading anywhere. That they're powerless. That they massively lack the power to impose their sanctions, or the West as such, not just the US, but also the EU, massively lack the power to impose their sanctions on the entire world, and that many states take a neutral standpoint and hedge their risks, their chances and risks. Risk containment, that's actually what they do. And part of risk containment is to take a neutral position in this war, as outrageous as it might be. And I'm certainly not neutral if it comes to that war, not at all. But I think that's the result that many countries take, and we should see it as a sign of not of cowardice, and not of a lack of commitment to human rights, but ultimately it's because they want to contain risks for themselves, and because risks are so unpredictable that they take a neutral standpoint. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say. As I said, as I warned you, this was a little bit of a kind of an impromptu, improvised presentation, where I tried to make sense of a lot of factors that probably require a lot of deeper research, and one could probably write an entire book on that. And I'm sure someone is already writing that book, but maybe that is still enough for a good discussion, I hope, at least. So thank you very much.